There is a photograph that still sits on a desk on the top floor of Callaway Tower. In it, a man in a gray janitor's uniform is holding a mop in one hand and a woman's hand in the other. Nobody who walks into that office and sees the photo would guess that the man in the picture owns the building. But 6 months before that photo was taken, that same man was invisible. He was the person people stepped around without looking down. He was the one who wiped up spilled coffee and picked up dropped papers and said "good morning" to people who never once said it back. What none of them knew was that the man mopping their floors controlled the company that signed their paychecks. And what he was about to discover about the people around him would end one woman's career, expose another woman's secret arrangement with a company director, and completely rewrite who would inherit a $4 billion empire. This is the story of Julian Callaway. And it starts, strangely enough, with a funeral that hadn't happened yet. Julian was 31 years old when his father, Desmond Callaway, sat him down in a hospital room and told him something no son wants to hear. "The doctors give me 18 months, Desmond said. Maybe less." Desmond Callaway had built Callaway Dynamics from a single shipping warehouse into one of the largest logistics and technology conglomerates on the East Coast. He had done it with his bare hands, his instincts, and a stubbornness that bordered on legend inside the company. Julian had grown up watching his father work 18-hour days, watching him shake hands with senators and sit quietly with night shift dock workers, treating both with the same respect. Julian had always assumed he had years to prepare for the moment his father would hand him the company. Now he had months. "There's something else," Desmond said that day, his voice quieter than Julian had ever heard it. "I don't want to leave this world worried about who's going to be standing next to you when the cameras are gone and the money runs thin, God forbid. I want to know you have someone who loves you. Not the name. Not the number in the bank account. You." Julian didn't answer right away. He was thinking about Vanessa. 2 years earlier, Julian had been engaged. Vanessa Price had been elegant, magnetic, and endlessly attentive until a false rumor spread through their social circle that Callaway Dynamics was quietly restructuring after a failed merger and that the family fortune might be cut in half. It wasn't true. It was corporate misinformation planted by a rival firm. But Vanessa didn't wait to find out. Within 2 weeks, she had returned the ring by courier, along with a note that read, "I don't think we're compatible anymore." Julian had never told anyone how much that note had gutted him. Not because he'd lost Vanessa, he realized quickly he'd never really had her, but because it proved something he'd feared his whole life. That everyone who got close to him was doing math in their head. That the version of him people loved was a spreadsheet, not a person. So when his father asked him to find someone real, Julian didn't think of dating apps or arranged introductions through family friends. He thought of something else entirely. Something reckless. Something that, if it worked, would answer a question he'd been asking since he was 19 years old. What happens when nobody knows I'm worth anything at all? Julian brought the idea to only one person, Marcus Reyes, the company's director of operations, and the only employee who had known Julian since he was a teenager sneaking into the warehouse to watch his father work. "You want to do what?" Marcus asked, nearly dropping his coffee. "I want to work in the building. Not as an executive. As a janitor. Nobody knows my face outside of the 10th floor and up. I've been overseas for 4 years finishing my MBA and running the London office. I want to use a different last name. I want to see how people really are when they think there's nothing in it for them." Marcus rubbed his temples. "Your father is going to have a heart attack. A second one." "My father is the one who told me to find someone real," Julian said. "This is the only way I'll actually believe it when I find her." There was a long silence. Then Marcus asked the question that mattered most. "What if you find out the answer is nobody?" Julian didn't have a response for that. It was the fear sitting quietly underneath the whole plan, and he chose not to look at it directly. 2 weeks later, Julian Callaway temporarily became Julian Hale, a temp cleaner assigned to the 40th floor of Callaway Tower, the very floor that housed the departments closest to executive leadership. Marcus arranged it through a shell staffing agency so that not even human resources would connect the dots. Only Desmond, from his hospital bed, and Marcus, from his office, would know the truth. Nobody else. Not even the woman running the front desk. Not even the supervisor who would soon be barking orders at the boss's son without knowing it. Before Julian put on the gray uniform, Marcus had done something Julian hadn't asked for. He'd quietly flagged 3 employees whose performance reviews, community reputation, and interpersonal conduct made them stand out among the 400 people on that floor. Not because Julian asked him to matchmake. Because Marcus, ever the strategist, wanted his boss's son to at least know where to start looking. "I'm not telling you who to fall for," Marcus said, sliding a folder across the desk. "I'm telling you who's worth watching." Julian opened the folder that evening in the modest 1-bedroom apartment he'd rented under the name Hale, a stripped-down life, no assistant, no driver, no schedule managed by 3 people. Just him, a folder, and 3 names. Renata Cole, Records Department. Quiet. Efficient. Rarely mentioned in office gossip, which in itself was unusual. Priya Anand, Client Relations. Charismatic, ambitious, aggressively networked. Known for climbing fast. Celine Marchetti, Executive Assistant Pool, Floor 39. Julian didn't know yet that one of these 3 names would nearly cost him everything. He didn't know that one of them had already, without realizing it, crossed paths with the Calloway family before. And he certainly didn't know that his cousin, Preston Calloway, the man who had spent a decade quietly resenting that the company would never be his, had a source inside that very building, watching every new hire, waiting for any excuse to prove to the board that Julian was unfit to inherit anything. All Julian knew, standing in front of a mirror in a uniform 2 sizes too big, was this: for the first time in his adult life, nobody was going to look at him and see dollar signs. He had no idea how quickly that would be tested. Julian's first assignment was the 40th floor lobby, the wide marble entrance where the important people passed each morning without appearing to notice anyone at all. His supervisor, a weathered man named Frank Dobbs who had run the cleaning crew for 11 years, gave him one instruction before disappearing into his own rounds. Keep your head down. Keep the floor dry. If somebody talks to you rude, you say nothing back. This building chews up people who talk back. Julian nodded, gripping the mop like it was the strangest object he'd ever held. Within the hour, he understood exactly what Frank meant. A junior analyst walked straight through the wet section Julian had just mopped, tracking footprints across the marble without so much as a glance downward. A woman in towering heels stopped, sighed loudly at the inconvenience of a chair blocking her path, and clicked her tongue at Julian as if he were the chair itself. Somebody's forgotten coffee cup rolled off a side table and nobody bent to pick it up. They simply waited, expectantly, for the man with the mop to do it. Then, at 8:47 a.m., Renata Cole walked in. She was unremarkable in the way that people who aren't performing for anyone are unremarkable: a plain coat, a canvas tote bag, hair pulled back simply. She stopped the instant she saw the wet floor sign. "Oh, sorry, let me go around," she said, stepping carefully to the dry side without being asked. "You're fine," Julian said. "Almost done. Take your time. I'd rather wait than make you remop the whole thing." It was such a small moment. 30 seconds, maybe less. But Julian noted it the way a man notes the first crack of light through a closed curtain, not proof of anything yet, just a possibility. An hour later, Priya Anand arrived, and the temperature of the room seemed to shift with her. She moved with the confidence of someone who assumed every space had been arranged for her convenience. "You need to move that bucket," she said, without breaking stride. "It's an eyesore right by the elevators. Clients see that." "Yes, ma'am. I'll move it right away." "Good. And try not to smell like bleach when people are around. It's unprofessional." Julian said nothing. He simply moved the bucket, filing the comment away with the same quiet precision his father used when reviewing a balance sheet. Not anger. Just data. By midday, Celine Marchetti passed through with 2 senior directors flanking her, laughing at something one of them had said. She glanced at Julian only once, a brief, assessing look, the kind of glance that catalogs a person's usefulness in under 2 seconds, and then returned her full attention to the men beside her. 3 women. 3 completely different first impressions. And Julian Calloway, disguised as Julian Hale, was only getting started. Over the next several weeks, a pattern began to form, though not the tidy pattern Julian expected. Renata was consistent. Every morning she said good morning to him by name, something almost nobody else on the floor bothered to do. She never made a show of her kindness. She simply behaved the same way whether her manager was standing beside her or 2 floors away. One afternoon, when a delivery cart tipped over and spilled a box of files across the hallway, Renata was the only person who knelt down to help gather them, alongside Julian, while 4 other employees stepped over the mess entirely. "You didn't have to do that," Julian told her. "Neither did you," she said. "But here we both are." Priya, meanwhile, was busy building what Julian began to privately call her audience strategy. She was kind, loudly, visibly kind, whenever someone with influence was nearby. She complimented a visiting board member's tie. She organized a charity bake sale that conveniently coincided with a week senior leadership was touring the floor. But Julian noticed something colder underneath. When a new intern spilled water on important paperwork, Priya berated him in front of 6 people, calling him careless and unfit for corporate work, only to pivot seconds later into a warm, professional tone the moment a director rounded the corner. As Celine was harder to read. She was gentle with everyone, polished, diplomatic, careful never to raise her voice. But Julian began to notice that Celine's kindness had a pattern to it. She was kindest to people who could be useful to her later. She remembered birthdays of managers. She brought coffee to directors' assistants. And she asked questions, small, seemingly harmless questions, about executive schedules, about upcoming leadership changes, about who exactly had been quietly meeting with Marcus Reyes twice a week. Julian didn't think much of it at first. Curiosity wasn't a crime. Then, 3 weeks into the experiment, something happened that turned quiet observation into real danger. It started with a whisper Julian overheard near the. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Then we watch her more carefully than the others. And Julian, you need to be ready for the possibility that she already suspects, and she's choosing to stay quiet for her own reasons. That's more dangerous than if she said something outright." He was right to worry. Because 2 days later, Celine cornered Julian near the break room, and what she said next was not a question. It was an offer. "I know you're not who you say you are," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I don't know exactly who you are yet. But I know enough. A janitor doesn't carry himself the way you do. A janitor doesn't correct grammar in a memo he wasn't supposed to read." Julian's stomach dropped. He'd made one mistake, one careless correction on a document left on a break room table, and it had been enough. "I'm not asking you to tell me everything," Celine continued. "I'm asking for one thing. When it comes time for promotions in client relations, I want my name at the top of that list. You help make that happen, quietly, and I forget I ever noticed anything strange about you." It was blackmail, dressed up in soft, polite language. And it told Julian everything he needed to know about Celine Marchetti's real character. She wasn't interested in the truth. She was interested in leverage. "I don't have that kind of power," Julian said carefully. "I'm a cleaner." Celine smiled, the same practiced smile she gave to directors in the hallway. "We both know that's not entirely true. Think about it, Julian. Or whatever your real name is." She walked away, leaving Julian standing in the break room with his hands shaking around a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold. If Celine's threat wasn't enough pressure, the second complication arrived from somewhere far more dangerous, Julian's own family. Preston Calloway, Desmond's nephew and Julian's cousin, had spent years quietly resentful that the company would never pass to him. He had a seat on the board, a modest office 2 floors above executive leadership, and an appetite for information that made him more useful to rival investors than he was to his own family. Preston had heard rumors, vague ones, filtered through gossip and a careless comment from a junior HR employee, that Julian had disappeared from public view for several weeks under mysterious circumstances. He didn't know about the janitor disguise. Not yet. But he'd hired a private investigator to find out exactly where his cousin had gone, hoping to find something, anything, that could be used to convince the board Julian was unfit to take over when Desmond passed. The investigator's early reports were vague. A temp employee named Julian Hale had been added to Callaway Tower's custodial staff around the same time Julian Callaway supposedly went on sabbatical. It wasn't proof. But it was enough of a thread for Preston to start pulling. Two dangers were now closing in on Julian from opposite directions, one from a coworker with something to gain, and one from a cousin with everything to lose. And Julian, standing at his mop cart each morning, had no idea both storms were building at once. Despite the danger circling him, Julian kept returning, quietly, almost helplessly, to the small, unremarkable moments Renata created without ever meaning to be watched. One evening, staying late to finish quarterly filing, Renata found an elderly security guard named Otis struggling to lift a supply crate near the loading dock. She didn't call for help. She didn't ask someone more capable to step in. She simply put down her bag and helped him carry it herself, refusing his repeated apologies. "You don't have to thank me," she told him. "This isn't a favor. It's just decent." Another time, a temp worker was publicly embarrassed by a manager for a minor filing error in front of the entire department. While others looked away, uncomfortable but silent, Renata was the only one who walked over afterward and quietly told the temp, "Everyone makes that mistake in their first year. Don't let him make you feel small over it." Julian began finding small reasons to be near her, not out of strategy, but because something about her steadiness felt like solid ground in a building full of shifting sand. One evening, after most of the floor had emptied out, Renata dropped a stack of folders while juggling her coffee and her bag. "Let me help," Julian said, kneeling to gather the papers. "Thank you," she said, and then, almost thoughtfully, "You know, most people here don't really look at me. I don't think they see me as invisible exactly, just background noise." "I don't think you're background noise," Julian said. She looked at him a moment too long, like she wasn't quite sure what to do with that sentence. "That's kind of you to say. Especially for someone who probably gets treated like background noise more than I do." She had no idea how true that sentence was about to become, or how much it would matter later. 6 weeks into the assignment, an incident occurred that crystallized everything Julian had been quietly gathering evidence of. During a small office celebration for a closed client deal, Priya, a glass of wine in hand, laughing loudly at her own joke, turned too quickly and spilled the entire glass across the newly cleaned floor, splashing the hem of her dress in the process. Instead of acknowledging the accident, she rounded on Julian, who had been nearby with his cart. "This is disgusting," she snapped, loud enough for half the room to hear. "This floor is a hazard. Clean it immediately, and honestly, you people should be more careful about where you leave these carts in the first place." "Of course," Julian said evenly. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." "Sorry doesn't fix my dress," she said, and walked off toward the restroom without another word, leaving the mess behind for him to handle entirely alone, no apology, no acknowledgement that the spill had, in fact, been her own doing. What Julian didn't expect was what happened next. Renata, who had witnessed Priya turn pale the moment she saw him standing at the front of the break room, uniform on, but flanked now by Marcus and 2 members of the executive team. "Some of you have known me for 2 months as Julian Hale," he said. "I want to be honest about why. I needed to know how people in this company treat someone who can do nothing for them. Because I believe, and my father has always believed, that how you treat the people who can't help your career tells you everything about who you actually are." Priya's voice came out smaller than usual. "I didn't know. I would never have." "That's exactly the problem," Julian said, not unkindly, but firmly. "None of you knew. That's what made it real." He turned toward Celine, who was staring at the floor. "I know what you tried to do these last 2 weeks. I'm not going to make a scene about it here. But you should know that blackmail, even quiet, polite blackmail, is still blackmail. HR will be speaking with you separately." Celine said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Then Julian's eyes found Renata, standing near the back of the room, stunned into silence like everyone else. "And you," he said, his voice softening, "never once asked me for anything. Never once treated me differently on the days I looked tired, Or the days I made mistakes, or the day I got yelled at for someone else's spilled wine. You had no idea who I was. You just decided, on your own, that decency wasn't something you saved for people who could reward you for it. Renata's eyes filled, though she tried to hold it together in front of the room. I meant every bit of that. I don't regret it, whoever you turn out to be. Good, Julian said. Because I'd like to take you to dinner. As myself, this time. The weeks that followed reshaped Callaway Tower in ways nobody expected. Priya was placed on a mandatory leadership and workplace conduct review after multiple employees, emboldened by what had happened, came forward with their own stories about how she treated people she considered beneath her. She kept her job, but not her upward trajectory, and within a year, she quietly transferred to a different company altogether, still convinced, by her own account, that she had simply been unlucky. Celine's situation was more severe. HR's investigation uncovered not just the attempted blackmail, but a pattern of manipulating scheduling records to undermine a coworker's promotion months earlier, the very Odette she'd once smiled at in hallways. Celine was terminated within 2 weeks, and her soft-spoken reputation, once her greatest professional asset, became the exact thing people remembered least kindly about her once the truth came out. Preston, having lost his bid to unseat Julian in the boardroom, found his position on the board significantly diminished. Desmond, in one of his final acts as chairman, restructured the family's voting shares to ensure Preston could never again attempt something similar. It wasn't cruelty. It was, as Desmond put it privately to Julian, protecting the people who actually deserved to inherit something. And Renata, a quiet, steady, unassuming Renata, became something none of them, including herself, ever expected. Not because Julian handed her a title. Because she asked, pointedly, not to be given one simply for dating him. I don't want a promotion because of who you are, she told him plainly, weeks into dating him openly. If I earn one, it needs to be because of what I actually do here. It was, in its own way, the final proof Julian needed. Not a grand declaration. Just one more instance of a woman who had never once, in 2 months of total anonymity or in the spotlight that followed, adjusted her values based on what she could gain. 2 years later, that promotion came anyway, not handed to her, but voted on unanimously by a records department that had worked alongside her long before anyone knew her last name would eventually be Callaway. She cried reading the email, not because of the title, but because it had come from the same coworkers who used to eat lunch beside her without knowing she'd one day be married to the man who signed their paychecks. She kept that email printed and folded in her desk drawer for years, long after it had any practical use, simply as a reminder that some things really can be earned instead of given. Desmond Callaway lived just long enough to see his son marry. The wedding was small, deliberately so, a request from both Julian and Renata, who wanted the day to feel nothing like the corporate galas either of them had grown tired of. Desmond, seated in a wheelchair near the front, wept openly during the vows, something Julian had never once seen his father do in 31 years. You asked me to find someone who loved me, not the name, Julian said quietly to his father afterward. I found her while I was nobody. I think that's the only way I ever would have believed it. Desmond took his son's hand. That's the only lesson that ever mattered in this whole business. Everything else, the buildings, the board seats, the money, none of it tells you who somebody really is. It only tells you what they're capable of building. The mop and the bucket told you something the boardroom never could. Desmond passed away 4 months later, peacefully, with his son and daughter-in-law beside him. A year after the wedding, Callaway Tower looked different in ways that weren't architectural. Julian, now running the company his father had built, instituted a policy that startled the board when he first proposed it. Every executive, including himself, would spend 1 week per year working an entry-level role somewhere in the company, unannounced and unpublicized. Cleaning crews, warehouse floors, call centers. No press releases. No performative gestures for cameras. Just a quiet, permanent reminder built into the company's culture. You don't learn who your company actually is from a quarterly report, Julian told the board during his first address as chairman. You learn it from how the people at the top treat the people nobody's watching. Renata never changed either. She still greeted the cleaning staff by name every morning. She still knelt down to help gather dropped files, whether or not anyone was there to see it. When people occasionally treated her differently now that she was married to the company's chairman, she brushed it off the same way she'd brushed off everything else, quietly, without needing anyone to notice that she had. Frank Dobbs, the weathered supervisor who once told Julian to keep his head down and never talk back, still ran the cleaning crew on the 40th floor. Julian made a point of stopping by every few weeks, not as an inspection, but as a visit, the same way he used to stop by as an employee, except now people knew exactly who was walking toward them. Frank never let the visits go to his head. "You're still late putting the wet floor signs out sometimes," he told Julian once, only half joking. "Some habits you never fully unlearn." Julian laughed harder at that than he had at anything in months. Mrs. Whitfield, the caterer who had once studied Julian's face a little too long in front of an old photograph, was invited to serve at his wedding the following spring. When she saw him at the altar, she leaned over to a coworker and said, loud enough for several rows to hear it, "I told you there was something familiar about that boy." Nobody had the heart to tell her she'd already come close to solving the mystery months before it became public. Julian let her have the moment. It felt like the least he owed her. Julian Calloway learned something in 2 months wearing a gray uniform that 31 years of privilege had never taught him. Money reveals what a person can afford. It never reveals who they actually are. Priya showed her character the moment she thought no one important was watching, and it cost her everything she'd spent years building. Celine showed hers the moment she thought leverage mattered more than honesty, and it ended a career built entirely on appearances. And Renata, without ever trying to prove anything to anyone, simply stayed exactly who she was, in a mop-stained hallway, in a boardroom she never expected to enter, and in every ordinary moment in between. In the end, that was the whole answer Julian had been searching for. Not in a resume. Not in a name. In the quiet, unwatched moments where people either choose kindness, or choose themselves. And the woman who chose kindness, every single time, was the only one who ever deserved to hear the truth.